Well, here we are, the final chapter. And this is where everything we've learned comes together into something you can actually act on. We've gone through the rules one by one, but knowing the rules and building a compliance program are two different things. So, in this chapter, we'll construct a practical roadmap. We'll start by bringing all the rules together into a coherent whole, then move through a phased approach. Phase 1: Discovery and data mapping, understanding what you have and where it is. Phase 2: Design and policy build, creating the notices, consent flows, and policies. Phase 3: Implementation and operationalization, actually putting it into practice. And Phase 4: Ongoing monitoring and audits, keeping it alive over time. We'll talk about sequencing your work against the rollout timeline so your effort lands in the right order. We'll cover the common pitfalls that derail compliance programs so you can avoid them. We'll lay out a 12-month action plan and then close with a recap of the whole journey and your next steps. This is the chapter that turns knowledge into action. So let's build your roadmap together. Let's begin. Let's begin by stepping back and seeing the whole picture. Because we've examined each rule closely, and now it's time to assemble them into a coherent system. Remember the map I gave you back in chapter 1? This is where it all connects. Think about the journey we've taken. We started with how data is collected, the notice rule, and the consent rules, which govern that first honest interaction with the individual. Then we moved to how data is protected once you hold it, security safeguards, breach reporting, and retention and erasure, the custody layer. We covered special situations, children's data, and cross-border transfers, and we explored the rights of individuals and the oversight of significant data fiduciaries and the board. Now here's the crucial insight. These rules aren't a checklist of separate, disconnected tasks. They're an interlocking system. Your notice feeds your consent. Your consent determines what processing is lawful. Your security protects what you've collected. Your retention rules decide how long you keep it. Your breach plan handles failures, and rights let individuals stay in control throughout. Pull one thread and the others move. Think of it like the systems in a human body. The circulatory, respiratory, and nervous systems each do their own job, but they only keep you alive by working together. Your compliance program is similar, a set of interconnected systems forming a healthy whole. Here's the instructor's takeaway as we move into building. Don't approach compliance as isolated boxes to tick. Approach it as one integrated program where the pieces reinforce each other. That mindset is what separates a genuinely compliant organization from one that has scattered, disconnected efforts that leave gaps between them. Let's begin the actual roadmap with Phase 1, discovery and data mapping, because everything else builds on this foundation. Here's the core principle, and you've heard me hint at it throughout. You cannot protect, govern, or comply for data you don't know you have. So the very first phase is about discovery, finding out what personal data you actually hold, where it lives, how it flows, and who touches it. Why start here? Because it's astonishing how often organizations genuinely don't have a clear picture of their own data. Data accumulates over years across systems, departments, and vendors, and no single person can tell you the full story. Beginning anywhere else is like trying to organize a house in the dark. You have to turn on the lights first. So what does this phase involve? You inventory your personal data, what categories you collect, from whom, and for what purposes. You map where it's stored and how it moves, including across borders and to processors, exactly the mapping we stressed in the cross-border chapter. You identify your data flows end to end. Think of it like a doctor doing a thorough examination before prescribing treatment. You wouldn't want a doctor guessing without first understanding your actual condition. Discovery is that examination for your data. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Invest real effort in this phase, even though it's unglamorous and can feel slow. The quality of everything that follows, your policies, your controls, your rights handling, depends on the accuracy of this picture. Organizations that rush past discovery end up with compliance built on guesswork, full of blind spots. Get this foundation right, and the rest of the roadmap stands on solid ground. Once you've discovered what data you have, you move into phase 2, design and policy build, where you create the actual structures and documents your compliance rests on. Here's the shift happening in this phase. Phase 1 was about understanding your current reality. Phase 2 is about designing your target state, what your compliant practices should look like, and building the foundational pieces to get there. So, what do you build in this phase? You design and draft your compliant notices, the clear, itemized, plain language notices we covered in the notice chapter. You design your consent flows, applying the 5 pillars: granular, freely given, with easy withdrawal. You build your internal policies, your retention schedules, your security policies, your breach response plans, your procedures for handling rights requests. Essentially, you're creating the blueprint and the rule book for compliant operations. Think of it like designing a building before construction. You don't start laying bricks randomly. You create detailed plans first, deciding how everything should be structured. Phase 2 is your design and planning stage, where good decisions now prevent expensive problems later. Let me emphasize something important here. This is where the integrated thinking we discussed really pays off. As you design, you ensure the pieces fit together. Your notice aligns with your consent flow, which aligns with your retention schedule, which aligns with your rights handling. You're not building disconnected parts, you're designing a coherent system. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Treat phase 2 as the careful design work that it is. Resist the urge to rush into implementation before you've thought through how everything should work and fit together. Solid design here makes implementation smoother and your whole program more robust. Good blueprints make good buildings. Now we reach phase 3, implementation and operationalization, where your designs and policies become living reality. This is where the rubber meets the road. Here's the essence of this phase. Phase 2 gave you the blueprints and rulebooks. Phase 3 is about actually building and activating them, turning documents into working systems, processes, and daily practices. So what happens here? You deploy your new consent flows and notices into your actual products and services. You implement the security safeguards you designed, the encryption, access controls, logging. You stand up your breach response workflow with roles assigned and ready. You build or configure the systems that handle retention, erasure, and rights requests, ideally with the automation we discussed for handling things at scale. You train your people because compliance isn't just systems, it's the humans who operate them. Think of it like the construction phase of that building. The plans were drawn in phase 2, now you're actually pouring concrete, raising walls, installing systems, and eventually moving in. It's where the vision becomes something real and usable. Let me stress a key point about this phase. Implementation is also about operationalization, making compliance part of how the organization actually runs day to day, not a one-time setup that's then forgotten. Your teams need to know how to handle a rights request, how to respond to a breach, how to apply the consent rules. It has to become embedded in normal operations. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Phase 3 is demanding because it touches real systems and real people. Expect it to take effort and coordination across teams. But this is where your compliance actually comes alive and starts genuinely protecting data principles and your organization. Build it well and embed it deeply. Let's complete the phases with phase 4. Ongoing monitoring and audits. And this is the phase that never really ends, because compliance is not a destination, it's a continuous practice. Here's the fundamental truth this phase reflects. You don't become compliant once and stay that way automatically. Things change, your data practices evolve, new features launch, threats shift, rules develop, and people come and go. Without ongoing attention, even a well-built compliance program decays over time. So what does this phase involve? You continuously monitor your data practices and security, watching for issues, breaches, and drift from your policies. You conduct periodic audits and reviews to verify you're still doing what you should, including the DPIAs and audits we discussed for significant data fiduciaries. You keep your notices, consent flows, and policies updated as things change. And you stay alert to developments in the regulatory landscape, adapting as the framework matures. Think of it like maintaining that building you constructed. You don't build it and then ignore it forever. You inspect it, repair wear and tear, update systems, and keep it safe and functional over the years. Phase 4 is the ongoing maintenance that keeps your compliance healthy. Let me give you a rhetorical question to sit with. Why do so many compliance efforts fail not at the start, but a year or two later? Because organizations treat compliance as a project with an end date rather than an ongoing operational responsibility. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Build monitoring and review into your normal rhythm with clear ownership and regular cadence. The organizations that stay genuinely compliant are the ones that treat it as a living, continuous discipline. Set up Phase 4 to run indefinitely because, in a real sense, the work is never fully done. Let's talk about something that can make or break your roadmap: sequencing your work against the rollout timeline. Because it's not just what you do, it's when you do it, relative to when obligations actually take effect. Remember our discussion back in Chapter 1 about the phased rollout, the 18 months, and that 12-month question? This is where that knowledge becomes strategically vital. Different obligations under the framework take effect at different times. Some apply sooner, others have a longer runway. The smart move is to align your compliance work so that each piece is ready by the time its corresponding obligation kicks in, not scrambling at the last minute and not wastefully early on things that aren't yet required while neglecting urgent ones. Here's how to think about it. Map each major obligation to its effective date. Then work backwards, figuring out when you need to start each piece of work to be ready in time. The things with the earliest deadlines, or the ones that take longest to build, like deep data mapping or refreshing consent for pre-existing data, should start first. Think of it like planning a complex meal where different dishes take different times to cook. You don't start everything at once, and you don't start the slow-cooked dish last. You sequence so everything's ready together at serving time. Compliance sequencing works the same way. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Be deliberate about ordering. Use the rollout timeline as your scheduling backbone. Tackle the longest lead and earliest due items first, especially foundational work like discovery and mapping that everything else depends on. Good sequencing turns an overwhelming pile of obligations into a manageable, well-timed plan. It's the difference between calm, steady progress and a frantic, last-minute scramble. Let me play the experience guide here and walk you through the common pitfalls that derail compliance programs so you can see them coming and steer around them. The first pitfall is treating compliance as a one-time project. Organizations push hard, declare victory, and then let it all decay. Remember Phase 4? Compliance is ongoing, not a finish line. The second pitfall is skipping or rushing discovery. Teams eager to show progress jump to building policies before truly understanding their data and end up with compliance full of blind spots. Slow down at the foundation. The third pitfall is working in silos, treating each rule as a disconnected task. Remember, these rules form an interconnected system, and gaps appear precisely in the spaces between siloed efforts. The fourth is the copy-paste trap, lifting another framework's documents like a GDPR notice and assuming it works for DPDP. The specifics differ, and shortcuts here create real exposure. The fifth pitfall is neglecting the people side. You can build perfect systems, but if your staff don't know how to handle a breach or a rights request, the program fails in practice. Train and embed. The sixth is forgetting the pre-existing data, focusing on getting new practices right while that mountain of old data sits unaddressed. And the seventh is waiting for perfect clarity, especially on evolving areas like cross-border rules, using uncertainty as an excuse for paralysis instead of doing the robust preparation that pays off anyway. Here's the instructor's takeaway. Most compliance failures aren't due to some exotic, unforeseeable problem. They come from these predictable human pitfalls. Knowing them in advance is half the battle. As you build your roadmap, keep this list nearby and honestly ask, are we falling into any of these? That self-awareness will save you enormous trouble. Let's get intensely practical now with a 12-month action plan, a sensible way to sequence your roadmap across a year. Think of this as a suggested rhythm you can adapt to your situation. In the early months, roughly the first quarter, focus on discovery and mapping. This is your foundation, so give it real time. Inventory your data, map your flows including cross-border and processors, and understand your current reality honestly. Also begin scoping the big lifts like pre-existing data and whether you might be a significant data fiduciary. In the second quarter, move into design and policy build. Draft your compliant notices, design your consent flows around the 5 pillars, and build your core policies, retention schedules, security policies, breach response plans, and rights handling procedures. In the third quarter, shift into implementation. Deploy your notices and consent flows, stand up your security safeguards and breach workflow, build your retention and rights systems with automation where you can, and crucially, train your people. In the final quarter, focus on operationalizing and transitioning into ongoing monitoring. Test everything, run a tabletop breach exercise, conduct your first reviews or audits, address pre-existing data, and establish the continuous rhythm of Phase 4. Throughout the whole year, sequence against the rollout timeline, pulling earlier anything tied to nearer deadlines. Here's the instructor's takeaway. This 12-month shape, discover, design, implement, operationalize, gives you a realistic arc from standing start to functioning program. Adapt the timing to your size and complexity, but keep the logical order because each phase genuinely depends on the one before. A year of steady sequenced effort beats a frantic, disordered scramble every single time. Use this as your backbone and adjust as you go. Well, we've reached the end of our journey together, so let's take a moment to recap and talk about where you go from here. Look at how far you've come. We started by understanding how the rules fit the act, the difference between principle and detail. Then, we walked clause by clause through the notice rule, consent managers, valid consent, security safeguards, breach reporting, retention and erasure, children's data, data principal rights, cross-border transfers, and significant data fiduciaries with the board. And finally, we assembled it all into a practical, phased roadmap. That's a genuinely comprehensive foundation. Here's what I most want you to carry away. These rules aren't just legal hoops to jump through. At their heart, they're about respecting people and their data, being honest about what you collect, protecting it properly, keeping it only as long as needed, and honoring people's rights over their own information. When you internalize that spirit, compliance stops feeling like a burden and starts feeling like simply doing right by the people you serve. So what are your next steps? Start with discovery. Go map your data because that foundation unlocks everything else. Then work through the phases at a steady, sequenced pace. Revisit specific chapters as reference whenever you tackle a particular rule. And keep learning because this framework will continue to evolve and staying current is part of the job. You now have the knowledge to build a real compliance program. The next move is to begin. I want to thank you sincerely for taking this journey through the DPDP rules with me. It's been a genuine pleasure teaching you. If this playlist helped you, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you get notified of new videos because there's always more to learn and I'd love to keep learning alongside you. Until next time, take care and go build something compliant and worth trusting.